Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well and that midterm last week wasn't too much of a pain on anybody. Of course, as I said in the past, give me about 2 weeks roughly to get all these grades in and feedback on your midterms, and then you will be working on editing this midterm to be your final paper. Of course, this was a one-page essay. This was focusing on your introduction. I gave you some tips on how to write your introduction, some loose structures that I was hoping to see, and then we're going to turn this using my comments into your final paper. There are going to be 1 million comments. Do not be offended. The more comments, the better. That means the more help you have in turning this paper into your final paper. And you can still, and if it hurts the ego at all, look at the grade. You probably aren't going to get that low of a grade unless you ignored the requirements. So I will get through those as soon as I can. It's going to take a while because I'm going to give you a lot of detailed feedback and read them over multiple times. So I will have read it over and over before I even get it back to you. So give me some patience with that and I'll get that back to you. I hope the course is going smooth for everybody. If it is, if there are any challenges, reach out to me, email me, happy to talk, and we can meet over Zoom and let's get going. All right, learning objectives. As I said I was going to do last week, I'm doing it again this week, even though I've heard no feedback. I'm going to include the questions that I have in the What Do We Learn slides instead of a general summary for our learning objectives. Today we're going to be able to answer, what is pluralism? What are winner takes all elections and how many states utilize this system? What is first past the post? What is ranked choice voting? What are 4 ways in which our Constitution addresses how we vote? And what is the difference between hard and soft money, in addition to what is the difference between open and closed primaries? All questions we'll be able to answer by the end of this lecture. Okay, so let's talk about some of the primary amendments that we reference when we discuss elections. So we have 5 main amendments that directly address how we elect individuals. The first we're going to look at is one we've talked about in the past in this course, which is the 12th Amendment. This amendment addresses how we elect the president. Remember, wow, my cats just went crazy over there. They just took down their cat tree. All right, I'll figure that out later. But to revisit this lecture, the 12th Amendment changed how we elect the president because we now vote for the president and the vice president on separate ballots. We remember that we had, sorry, the cats are going crazy. But we vote for them on separate ballots. This was because we had members of opposing political parties and ideological viewpoints representing the executive branch of the presidency and the vice presidency simultaneously, as we had John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And through that time period, we revealed significant conflicts in this form of governance. We also see after the 18th election, we needed to implement a system for what we do if we have a tie among our electors. That tie would result in the House of Representatives casting a tie-breaking vote for the presidency. So that is how the 12th Amendment addresses our elections. We also see the 17th Amendment gave people the right to vote for their senators. Originally, we had you were allowed to vote for your state representatives, and then they would, in many states, appoint senators to represent them on the national level. This changed when we implemented the 17th Amendment and expanded democratic access to governance. We also see the 19th Amendment, one of the great ones, legally granted women the right to vote in 1920. This was a little delayed, but we see that women's suffrage eventually garnered their right to vote with the implementation of the 19th Amendment in 1919, some people. It was really when it started its momentum. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes in national elections, part of the civil rights period as we're trying to expand access to our democratic processes. And we see the 26th Amendment, the second to last amendment implemented, as we only have 27 amendments in our Constitution. And this amendment made the legal voting age 18 instead of 21 in response to rising public sentiments and protests against inclusion of the Vietnam War, as individuals were allowed to die for their country but were not able to vote for their country. This protest, this sentiment, and this public participation, political participation by many individuals in the nation revealed a need for the implementation of the 26th Amendment. Just one example of how it can show that you have access to government and your voice matters and you can make change through involvement in political practices. We see that our Constitution states, quote, The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to the place of choosing senators. Our Article 2 of our Constitution says, quote, the Congress may determine the time of choosing electors and the day on which they shall give their votes, which day shall be the same throughout the United States. We see various acts of legislation happening on the federal level, Voting Rights Act. We also see FEC regulations on how we have campaigns run. When we look at expanding and restricting voting rights on the federal level, of course, a lot of this right now is just discussion, a little background on elections and campaigns. But when we discuss federal government's role in expanding or restricting voting rights, if we look at it at large, we see that the federal government tends to expand voting rights while states have a tendency to restrict their voting rights. You look at the Voting Rights Act of 1964, federal level, large period of expansion. And then you can also see the disenfranchisement, felony disenfranchisement, which is something we'll go over in, I believe, week 11, which is that it's a state law that varies by states, but some states in the United States have legislation that if you get convicted for a felony, you lose your right to vote for varying periods of time, either while you're dealing with your sentence or up until the rest of your life. And this is for all felonies, regardless of their merit. So we see that federal and state roles vary at times, and in recent years we've seen this unique relationship between the two entities. Okay, and what we're talking about here on this slide is pluralism, something we've talked about time and time again in this course, but it's a definition that we must be able to confidently present. Pluralism, a condition or system in which two or more states, groups, principles, sources of authority, etc. coexist. Think of it simply as two or more groups vying for power in a single system of government. Now, when we have multiple groups vying for power, how do we determine who the winner of these elections are? How do we determine when we only elect one individual to represent a single district, single member districts? How do we determine who that individual is going to be? Are we going to have the plurality rule or the majority rule? Well, there's a distinction here. The plurality rule is basically stating you simply need to have the most votes out of all candidates to win the office. The majority rule says you need to have the majority of all voters supporting you in order to win the office. Now, we have these systems both existing in different states. Plurality voting exists in the majority of our states. We have numerous elections that run on this system, but we do look at Georgia and some others, and we've heard the term runoff election. It might have been confusing to you in the past, but a runoff election happened because we did not get a single candidate who obtained over 50% of the vote. So instead of just giving them the win when they only had 45%, even though everybody else had less, we would then have a runoff election where we get rid of a candidate or do something along those lines, depending on the system, the electoral system in place in that state. This varies at times, but we do know that you need to get 50% plus one vote to be able to win the election. This is evident, and we've heard it on the national level. We've seen it on the news time and time again coming from Georgia, but we've seen it in multiple other states as well. So why does this matter? Well, remember we talked about Duverger's law last week. That concept that asks two questions. How many votes, what percentage do you need to gain representation? And are voters encouraged to vote honestly? Well, in a plurality rule system, there is a lower threshold to gain representation. So there is a greater degree, according to Duverger's law, for voters to vote honestly. On majority rule voting, you may see that the candidate that perfectly represents your interest does not have as adequate of a chance, so you will vote for a second in line interest to prevent a worst case scenario, which would be the political opposition, whoever that may be. So we can see that whether we choose a plurality rule or a majority rule influences the degree in which voters and citizens of that district are encouraged to vote honestly or strategically. So when you ask yourself what your preference is with this week's assignment, what type of electoral system would I prefer? Think, do you prefer a plurality rule or a majority rule when it comes to determining who the winner is of a single member district? We can also consider not having single member districts, and we'll talk about that momentarily. So what is a winner takes all system? This is a form of plurality voting, plurality rule. And this basically states whoever wins the majority of the votes gets 100% of the state's electoral votes / they win the election. So focus very exclusively on that part that says get 100% of electoral votes. Think of this exclusively in regards to the presidency. This is present, as I say in that bullet point, in the presidential election regarding electoral college votes, and it's present in congressional and state legislative elections. So, winner takes all. You have to have single member districts, so you're electing one individual to represent your state, your region, or your nation. So, say you get 48% voting for one candidate and 46% voting for another. The candidate with the most votes, 48%, would obtain the entirety of the office, even though they only have 2% more votes than their counterpart. They would obtain the office and their counterpart would lose the election and simply continue their life as they were before. Now, if this is considering the Electoral College, we can see that a president who wins a certain state, even if they win the state 49% and their opponent won 48.9%, they would still win 100% of these electoral college votes. And this is in place in 48 out of our 50 states, the vast majority of our states. It is not present in Maine and Nebraska. We'll go over those in just a moment. But we see that if, let's say, Montana is a good example, although you'll see that we have, I think it is about 4 electoral college votes. Every state gets at least 3 for your 2 senators and at least a House representative. I believe Montana during the last census grew to have 4. So with these 4 electoral college votes, even though we have, let's say, 25% of the population voting Democratic, I don't know if that's perfectly accurate, that's just for this example, we do not allow that a single one of our 4 electoral college votes to go to that collective. So they go unrepresented when it comes to our electoral college distribution in the federal presidential elections. This exists in most states again, but there's some examples where this is not in place, and those consist of Maine and Nebraska. And it's kind of works out as a good balance. Maine, a predominantly Democratic state, Nebraska, a predominantly Republican state. It is nice that we have one of each, and it evens out on the federal stage. And we also see that when it comes to the electoral college, they do not have the most sway, as they only have 4 and 5 electoral college votes. So Maine almost always gives 1 electoral college vote to Republicans, 3 for the most part Democrats, but that third one is sometimes up in the air. Nebraska, very similarly, they have a region in the state where it is almost always voting Democratic. So you see 1 going to the Democratic Party, 4, sometimes 3 going to the Republican Party. They split their electoral college votes to more accurately represent the population and the sentiments of that state. Now, many argue that this dilutes the political sway of certain states that do have predominantly Republican or Democratic representation, while there is an argument for this that it simply has a system in which you are represented more accurately. But remember, that's not winner takes all. Winner takes all is what's happening in the other 48 states. That is where you have one candidate winning the majority of the votes in any way. This doesn't even matter. It doesn't even determine how they win the election. Only focuses on what we do once we know who the winner is. We know who this winner is. Now we give them all of the electoral college votes. Now that we covered winner takes all, which focuses on what we do once we know who the winner is and how we allocate the electoral college votes, let's talk about first past the post, also known well as plurality rule voting. This is when you have single member plurality voting districts. What I mean by that is you have a collective, a district, say Kalispell, Montana, and you're electing one individual, only one individual to represent your body. And this is, of course, a representation of plurality rule. So what does that mean? That means you do not have to reach 51% or 50% plus 1 vote. You need to reach more votes than your counterparts. So citizens vote for one candidate in a single member district, and the candidate with the majority of the votes wins the election. That is what first past the post focuses on. This is a very simple system of elections. This allows candidates to win elections with the minority of the voting population, which is something that happens in the vast majority of elections. We also see that we do have this implemented in not all states. We have this implemented in 48 of 50 states. It is Maine and Alaska who both have different systems, and they have ranked choice voting, which we will talk about in the next slide. Ranked choice voting is gaining in popularity. We had a ballot referendum in the state of Montana in the last election that did not get passed. My opinion on that doesn't matter. Just it's fascinating that we even had access to voting on that kind of initiative. That happened in numerous states, and since I've made this slide, I'm not sure if we've increased the number of ranked choice voting states, and I do believe, and I know it was on the ballot in many states. I'll have to revisit this and examine the new laws in those various states, but prior to the most recent election, we know that Maine and Alaska were the only states utilizing any system of ranked choice voting. So let's talk about ranked choice voting. Okay, so ranked choice voting is an electoral system where voters rank candidates by preference on their ballot. This can exist in single-member districts or multi-member districts, and the variations in the way ranked choice voting is implemented depends on the state, but let's talk about it through with an umbrella understanding on how it's generally implemented and generally understood. So since we have a vast majority of, well, we have all single-member districts, we want to look at it through the lens of a single member district. Again, single member district is when you're electing one representative to represent a specific population. In this system, we would have, say, 4 people running for that single office. Well, in this system, we don't just have to choose one as a voter. We have the opportunity to rank all 4 by preference, and we can cast our ballot with that preference, that order in line. So say I am a hardline libertarian. There's a candidate, I think there's a candidate in the Flathead, Sid Daoud, that libertarian that gets a little bit of traction every now and then, not advocating for him at all, not advocating against him, just putting a name to the fate, to the idea. So you have a libertarian, and Sid Daoud, the libertarian, might represent my ideologies perfectly. In a ranked choice voting system, I would vote for them. I would vote honestly, and I would say that they would get my first rank vote. But in this system, if the libertarian only got 5% of the vote after the first round of voting, and nobody got over 50%, nobody else, then that libertarian candidate will be taken out of the election. Sadly, sorry, at least he had the chance. And everybody who voted for that person as their first choice, their second choice, remember you get to rank your candidates by preference, their second choice would then go into effect. Their vote no longer goes to Sid Daoud, and they're libertarian, so they have some moderate fondness for the Republican Party. Their second choice of the Republican candidate would then go into effect. So we see that, and this would occur until we have a candidate who has 50% plus 1 vote of the general population. So let me backtrack a little bit. Ranked choice voting, you elect one individual, but you get to choose your preference on multiple individuals. You get to rank them by preference, and then occurs, they cancel out the person with the lowest votes and redistribute their votes up until a single candidate has 50% of the vote. This is majority rule. So this is a great way to understand the difference between the two systems that exist in the vast majority of the United States. Plurality voting, while ranked choice voting is a majority rule system. There are variations of ranked choice voting where it's not as hardline, but almost all systems with ranked choice voting require 50% of the vote. Arguments for ranked choice voting claim that this opens up elections for third parties, and we've seen this happen in Maine and Alaska where it's been in place. We see primarily 1 or 2 third-party libertarian candidates gaining representation, which is more accurate to what the general population views are within government, but we also see it does not have a significant break to the 2-party system that exists in the United States, as the majority of candidates do stem from those 2 collectives. We also see that this encourages more moderate representatives from both of the political parties. There is an argument that we've seen rising extremism among the general population, among candidates in the past, well, in various points in our history. Ranked choice voting is viewed as a tool to mitigate that and encourage people that can appeal to the moderates, because if you are a hardline Democratic candidate and you can't be a second choice vote for those third party preferred individuals, then you will not have a high likelihood of winning the election. So that candidate is then encouraged to be a more middle of the road candidate that would exist, of course, for both political parties. So ranked choice voting is a system on the rise in many political theorists' eyes. You see it gaining traction, and many are writing about it. So very fascinating concept to look into. All right, so in this slide, we're talking about the Electoral College. The Electoral College is something that, for one, we're going to be covering a lot in this course, well, this week's lecture. We also look at the readings, and we see a good amount of readings regarding this dimension, and it's covered in our discussion post. This is where you get to, and I included in the discussion post because this is one where we have a lot of opinions on, and I want you to be able to have an opportunity to professionally and respectfully advocate for your opinions and engage with those who disagree, again, respectfully and professionally. So, the Electoral College, something a lot of us do not know, is this originates from a compromise made by our founding fathers. Some wanted the president appointed by the Senate, while others wanted the president to be determined through a, quote, popular vote of qualified citizens. And we know the popular vote of qualified citizens is the one that I can't even speak today, that won out. We also see that the Constitution addresses the term electors in the 12th Amendment, but beyond this, we do not see too much inclusion in our Constitution. But we do have reference to electors and the Electoral College through our documents. And because of that, we see that a constitutional amendment is required to abolish or change the Electoral College. It's very fascinating. In one of our readings that I actually encourage you to skim. You don't have to know the details of it. It's not a history course, but a general government course. And the reading provides the historical background and context of a period in which we almost abolished the Electoral College in the 1970s as a publicly supported amendment was brought forward, but it failed due to a successful filibuster led by Strom Thurmond, a noteworthy individual on the federal stage at the time. Now, the main takeaway about the Electoral College is that you need 270 Electoral College votes in contemporary politics to win a presidential election. Remember, how do we come up with that number? When we talked about the legislative branch, we talked about how it is all House representatives plus all senators and 3 from Washington, D.C. because they matter too. And that is how we get the total number of Electoral College votes. And that is distributed in a very specific way we will go through in just a moment. Let me see. Just want to go through some of my notes here. And yeah, so, and we do remember that they do state electors in the 12th Amendment, and we see this referenced throughout our Constitution. So the Electoral College is a part of our Constitution, and in order to change it, we would need another amendment, and that is one of the primary takeaways from this specific slide. Now, we'll go back to the Electoral College, but let's talk about political campaigns for a second. Now, during a political campaign period, we see these collectives called political action committees. These are committees representing interest groups, labor unions, or corporations, and their primary purpose is to raise and distribute campaign donations in order to get specific individuals elected. Now, we also see collectives considered super PACs. This is, when you're oversimplifying things to get a beginning introduction, it's like a PAC, but bigger, zoomed out, and more regulated. But let's speak more honestly. They're PACs with unlimited contributions, but they have, as I just said, they have strict regulations. They're regulated more heavily. They cannot directly interact with campaigns or distribute funds to campaigns directly. So we see many super PACs and PACs act on the national and state level when it comes to election periods. Now, let's revisit political action committees. Now, these committees represent interest groups, labor unions, corporations, ideologies, various different collectives, and they often do openly raise money and they distribute those to candidates who represent their interests. We also see when we look at super PACs, this action changes a little bit. They put out campaigns and ads advocating for one individual or one ideology, but again, because of their unlimited contributions, since we do not have to track the amount of money and who is providing money to super PACs, we do regulate how they spend the money heavily. So a political action committee, we heavily regulate how they raise money because we have to track every donation. You have to understand they have to be filed. And then the super PACs, you do not have to file as much when it comes to the fundraising end, but you do have to have detailed record keeping when it comes to the spending, while political action committees do not have as heavy scrutiny on how they distribute their campaign funds. Now, this has been recently changed. Well, not that recently. I'm a little outdated myself here, but when I was just getting interested in politics, we saw something called Citizens United, a Supreme Court ruling that established no limitations on spending in politics, and basically stating that a limitation on spending in politics, is equal to a limitation on free speech. This is where we saw, through Citizens United, the creation of super PACs. Before the late 2000s, we did not have super PACs operating anywhere in our government. This has been a recent development and coincided with a rapid increase in money spent in politics. As there was less regulation, we saw increased amount of money funneling through campaigns. And we see significant increases in the amount of money in politics. So Citizens United opened the door for super PACs. Previously, it was just political action committees advocating for their specific interess. And of course, that was a great way to participate in politics. You have a political action committee that speaks to you specifically. Get engaged, get involved, and contribute, donate, and you would see your interests advocated for. Now we also see that happening in super PACs on a much larger scale, and as a result of Citizens United. So Citizens United provided two primary conclusions: that if you limit money in politics, you are limiting free speech in politics. And because of this, we created a pathway for super PACs. Now let's talk a little bit more on Citizens United. And as you can see right here, I put Citizens United 2009 because I'm inconsistent and I probably should have made that correction. But this is when the hearing began and the ruling was provided in early 2010. Because remember, Supreme Court ruling, this is a process, they needed people to defend both sides of the argument and hear both sides of that said argument. Now, our textbook does state, quote, the main beneficiaries of the new rules were not corporations, but ideological interest groups. They're often funded by extremely wealthy individuals, end quote. That is directly from our textbook. And that focuses on the point I made before. This created super PACs, and super PACs did not regulate funding, opening the door for extremely wealthy individuals to contribute more than they were previously allowed to. And an example of that is, and if you were to donate funds to a state candidate here in Montana, you could not donate more than a specific amount. If you were donating to somebody running for a house, it would be about $450. Senate, it's a little bit more. State, nationwide elections, a little bit more. But there are direct regulations on how much a single individual could contribute during an entire election period. So it's not that. So you couldn't contribute $400 5 times. You could only do it one time, and that is it. Super PACs allow you to donate $1 million 20 times if you desired. So it opened the door for extremely wealthy individuals to contribute to ideological interest groups. And these ideological interest groups, again, because they're super PACs, because of Citizens United, cannot give their money to candidates directly. They can't talk to candidates about how they want to be framed, how their ads want to be framed. They can instead just put out ads for their interests and even for a candidate directly, but as long as they do not interact with that candidate or give funds to that candidate. And these super PACs, as I'm talking about right now, they cannot directly interact with the campaign, but they can receive unlimited amounts of money from corporations, unions, and other groups. This, as I stated previously, increased the amount of money in politics. And there is a video on Eagle Online. It's optional, but it provides a little bit more background on Citizens United. This is something that you have to have a general understanding of. The main takeaways from Citizens United in this course are that it established super PACs and correlates with an rapid increase in amount of money spent in politics. You continue on in political science. I encourage you to have a more detailed understanding of how this plays into regulations on federal elections and really what other legislative actions occurred that address this same topic. But again, this course established super PACs and made it to where regulating money is equal to regulating free speech. Okay, so when we talk about money in politics, it's very important to make the distinction between soft and hard money. So when we talk about hard money in politics, we have to understand that hard money is when you as an individual directly donate funds to a political candidate. This is when, say, you were interested in a candidate here in Montana, you wanted to support their cause in the district that you live in, you could contribute, say they're a House district candidate, up to $450. And then you could not give them another penny for the rest of the election cycle. Say it was the primary, day one, they just announced you donated $450. They won the political primary, and then it's a few days before the general election. You want to donate again? Well, you can't because you've already reached your max. That is why in hard money, there are hard regulations on how you can contribute them. But they're loose regulations, traditional regulations on how the candidate can spend them. Of course, they cannot go spending them on private matters. They can't do what that guy George up in New York did, George Santos, as that was pretty noteworthy on the news, plastic surgery, things of that nature. Funny, fascinating, fun discussions. Not important here. Just an example of how there are still regulations on how candidates spend hard money, and just like there are regulations on how much money you can contribute to a candidate. And that is all hard money. Now let's talk about soft money. Soft money is when you donate funds generally to a state or local party or to political action committees for general political purposes. Oftentimes you see a collective that aligns with you ideologically and you donate to them and they want to advocate for candidates for their general cause. You're not contributing to a specific campaign or a specific individual, but your funds will eventually go to advocate for some campaigns or individuals. Soft money, there is not as much of a regulation on the onset as when you look at soft money. If you donate through a super PAC, there's not high regulations on how much you can contribute, but there are high regulations on how they can spend that money. Just another example of the difference between money going through super PACs and political action committees and directly to candidates. So hard money funds directly contributed to candidates by individuals or political action committees, but that again, say you contribute to a political action committee, you donating is an example of soft money in politics. If they take that money and directly give it to a candidate, that's an example of them distributing hard money to candidates. But soft money goes through institutions, while hard money goes to candidates in their campaigns. Put simply in one sentence. Now, when we talk about the political process, we do want to remember that there are two periods in an election cycle. There are the primary and the general elections. So what happens in the primary? Why are there these two different time periods? Well, it's important to remember that the primary is ran by the political parties. They have the sole authority over how primary elections operate. They can have either closed or open primaries. I'll go into that in just in a moment. But primaries are party specific. You will have the Democratic primary and the Republican primaries happening around the same time, but completely separate. So you have a pool of just specifically Democratic and just specifically Republican, and you choose from them, and that is when you elect your party candidate. This individual does not represent anybody in our government yet, but they then have the opportunity to run representing their political party for an office within government. Now, when you look at the primary process, there are two kinds of political primaries. There is an open and then there is a closed. So a closed primary is where you have to declare that you are going to vote in one or the other primary. You say, I will vote for the Democratic primary, but you cannot cast a ballot for the Republican primary. You may remember this last election if you voted in the primary process. They sent you a ballot. They actually sent you 3 or 4 ballots, a ballot for each political party. Then you could vote for, remember Donald Trump or RFK. You could make that choice. You could also vote for the local Republican candidates and exclusively them. But you had to make a decision because Montana has closed primaries. You could only send back one ballot, even though you obtained 4 different ballots for each party. So you have to choose a party you are going to vote in their primary for. Now, once you have chosen a party, you do not have to vote for that party's candidates when the general election comes. You can vote however you desire, but you cannot vote in multiple primaries because the argument for closed primaries is that individuals were encouraged to vote for the worst candidate for the opposing party and the best candidate for their party. So we would have individuals heavily encouraged to strategically vote within one primary and honestly vote in another. Now, this is a system that is in place in some states. This is called an open primary. When people can vote in the primary election regardless of their party identification, you can send back both your Democratic and Republican primary ballots. Now, the laws in primary processes vary by state significantly. In 21 states, at least one political party conducts open primaries for congressional and state level offices, while in 14 states, one political party conducts closed primaries for congressional and state level offices, while in 15 states, at least one political party conducts semi-closed primaries. We won't go into the details on the semi-closed, but we do know that it is just, we do have to remember the distinction between closed and open primaries. Now, semi-closed is where you can, vote in either political party primaries, but you can only vote in a single primary. Those specifics we'll deal with later on. But the distinction here is closed primaries, you pick one party, you declare, you vote for your members within that party, and then you can vote for the opposing party's candidate in the general election, but in the primary election, you cannot vote in their primary as well. Now, why do I have that term caucuses down there? Well, a caucus is very similar to a primary, except think of it simply as you have to physically be there. Caucus is where you have a large collective of individuals meeting in one place to cast their ballots on who the party leadership will be. We saw in 1970. Excuse me, sorry. So we saw in the 1970s, this was actually a period in which we saw a wide wave of primary processes replacing the caucus process in all states, pretty much. Now, the first state to implement a primary for federal elections was Oregon in 1910, actually. And as we stated, it became a norm in the 1970s after the disorder within the Democratic Party, which was represented by the 1968 Democratic Convention, as caucuses were not becoming reliable, and many believed they were alienating large segments of the population. So we see, sorry, I just wanted to look at some of my notes, but we do know our primary takeaway from this slide is understanding what a closed primary is and what an open primary is, and the distinction between the two. Closed primary, you can only vote for one party, you can only send back one of those ballots. Open primary, you can send back multiple ballots. Now, we also want to remember that political parties have authority over their primary processes. This is one of the main reasons why we saw delays in civil rights expansions through the primary process, as there was acts like grandfather clauses, poll taxes, literacy tests, and things of that nature that restricted people significantly from reaching the polls during political primaries. Now, how do primaries work? I told you a lot of details about them, what an open primary is, what a closed primary is, who's in charge of operating and running primary processes, but I haven't talked about the term you've probably heard a lot on the news, delegates. So we see in political primaries, delegates are selected at the state level. Let me just give you a walkthrough on this process. You, an interested individual, you want to get involved in politics. Well, you look up, let's say you're a Republican. You look up Flathead Republicans. You see that they meet every now and then. There's simple discussions. They talk about what's interesting to the general people who identify in this collective. They give people opportunity to say what they're unhappy about when it comes to government. So these individuals meet every now and then. One of these meetings during election periods is where they determine to vote for the delegates to represent their district. This is, say you have Flathead, it could be something like 15, 20 individuals representing Flathead specifically. So you do not have to be known on a large scale. You simply have to go to a meeting and say, I want to represent our collective. They would select you if you can, get enough traction at that meeting, which you probably could if you just show up. They will select you to represent the collective at the state convention. The state convention is where you would then go and you would meet with every other delegate from around the state. You would discuss the party platform, you would discuss the approach of the party, various things within that the party structure. But one thing that would happen at this state convention, you would vote for your national convention delegates. So it's the same process that just happened in your local neighborhood, but happening in the state level. You would go up, everybody would have the opportunity to, but you would give a speech and say, please appoint me as one of the delegates to go to wherever it is where they have the national convention every election season. And the national convention has a small selection of individuals from each state. They go acting as delegates. They are still just delegates. And these individuals will cast their vote for who will represent the political party during the next election cycle. No, nowadays this is a very just it's for publicity, not really for publicity. It's not really. It's more for show. You see that we already know who the candidate is within both parties before this process because we have political primaries. But after our primaries have occurred, we see this as the final step that solidifies the primary candidates as we meet at the convention. So through this process, you can become a delegate, and then you are sent to the convention, which occurs at the end of a primary season for the most part. So we see you can be a delegate and you can access the primary process significantly by going to the national convention. We also see that there are collectives known as superdelegates. These are people that, well, if you want to be a superdelegate, you gotta be a representative on some level or noteworthy individual within the party for a bit first. These are often past party representatives who vote at the national convention in the interest of the party at large. So we see that when we have national conventions within the parties, which we have in recent years with the Democrats and the Republicans, we will see delegates and superdelegates casting their ballot, their final vote to see who we will have representing our political parties. Now, these delegates and superdelegates often determine who they vote for based on who the majority of the population in their district voted for. So we see a degree of democracy here, and it is maintaining that structure as we have almost always have these delegates voting in line with their general populations. But we do see that this is a check on the general population in a sense that has not been utilized in recent years, but does exist and relies on general practices and understanding the general rules. So we see our takeaway from this slide, how primaries work. You elect delegates that you could be, to go to the national conventions and as well as superdelegates, and they vote to determine who the party representative would be in the most recent election. The winners of those votes were Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. So what did we learn this week? Here are those same things. Remember, next slide has all the answers. What is pluralism? Multiple groups vying for power. Winner takes all elections. If you win the election, doesn't matter how. If you win, we give you all the electoral college votes. We see first past the post voting. If you get more votes than your counterparts, you win the election. Ranked choice voting. You get to rank your candidates, but if that first choice doesn't even have a chance, we'll consider your second choice vote. Our Constitution immensely addresses our elections from the way we, allowing people to vote when they were 18 instead of 21, expanding voting rights to women. The 12th Amendment, we change how we vote for the president and we also and the vice president. 17th Amendment, expanding voting rights to allow us to vote for our senators as well. We see the difference between soft and hard money, the degree, whether it is going through a political action committee, super PAC, or if it goes directly to the candidate. Soft money goes through state or federal parties, while hard money goes directly to candidates. We also see open and closed primaries. Open primaries, you can turn your ballot in you can turn multiple ballots in for both political parties. Closed primary, you have to select one political primary to contribute to. Montana has a closed primary system. Here are your answers. And make sure you go through what we have to do this week. There are a bunch of readings online. Some of them are optional, just little aids to the lecture, little videos. I think it's very helpful when I give you a 1-minute video that very directly gives you the objective points. In these lectures, I like to ramble on, give you the whole picture, have a somewhat of a discussion, try and do it like I do the lectures in class. But if I'm being honest, in class it's a lot more fun because you get to yell at me in the middle of my comments and points and say, what about this? What about that? And I will, you get to challenge me. I at times seem to challenge myself in these lectures doing this to this computer screen because it just messes up my mojo. But we're on this and we got this together. So make sure you go through everything. Email me with any questions about the lecture, the content, or anything. Contribute to your discussion post, and yeah, I'll get to those midterms as soon as possible, and I will let you know what I think. Get back to me with any thoughts or comments about any of this. We got this.